College football nerds here talking TCU and Michigan, and this is going to be an interesting one because we've been struggling a little bit with it. Josh is here with me. We're going to get nerdy and going to give y'all a couple of homework points in this one, but just to start out, give us your score predictions in the comments, and we'll get down there and tell you how you are wrong, or if you agree with us, then you're absolutely right. Josh, we're really struggling with this game, and we just talked about Kansas State and Alabama and how it's hard to know SEC, Big 12, conference isolation. We've got some of that here as well. And, Michigan's big win this year obviously is Ohio State. They didn't have a Power 5 opponent out of conference. TCU played Colorado out of conference, which is, that's not TCU's fault, but Colorado's worse than, they were FCS quality this year. So there's not a lot to glean from out of conference play for either one of these teams. Michigan fans are going to tell you, Josh, we already shut down the number one offense in the country, so we're not going to have a problem with TCU, right? Because they're not as good as Ohio State. I want to talk through this concept of, and Ohio State fans might get upset if they're watching this, but I've not been super impressed with their offense schematically. I think they have elite players, but I think they've been winning a lot on the talent advantage more so than the scheme advantage. Conversely, I think TCU has a little bit of a talent deficit, although I love them at their skill positions. Is there a situation where you could see Michigan struggling more because they have a lot of talent with a team that has an elite offensive scheme versus a team like Ohio State that doesn't have a great scheme in my mind, or at least they haven't had lately, but has elite players? Is there a pathway to TCU winning on scheme alone that could give Michigan fits where Ohio State couldn't?
I think it's a fair question, and I want to count something you said, right? When you talk about elite talent, TCU is very talented offensively, and I think one of the things they bring to the table that Ohio State doesn't is probably more balance in the offensive skill positions. I mean, Miller's a good back. I'm not sure that he's going to go drafted as high as Trevion Henderson. Granted, he wasn't healthy for that Michigan game, but from the receiving perspective, you got Quentin Johnson, you got Barber. Like, there are a lot of different guys of different types of skill sets that can come to the table. They absolutely have top-end speed. They have top-end size. I'm not sure they have them in the combination that makes you a first-round draft pick across the board, which, to be fair, that's what Ohio State has right now. But what they have is more variety, more balance, and I think they have a scheme that uses that variety in a more effective manner. It doesn't really matter how much speed you have. If you don't have the ability to make a defense sort of adjust to you short and throw over the top, or when you stretch them over the top, then you hit them underneath. TCU does that. They kind of play with you, rubber band you a little bit, get you out of position, and then pop you when you start overextending yourself. So I think that is an interesting challenge for Michigan, because I think Michigan's defenses for the past several years have been most effective when they've been able to play well within their scheme. I think Michigan is an extremely well-coached team. Easily one of the best coach teams in the country. The defensive side of the ball, they finally made that transition from a few years ago where we would complain that they'd be number one or number two in the country in total defense, but they weren't equipped to play anybody that was in any way aggressive offensively, and they would just get exposed at the end of the season every year. I don't think they're that same team anymore, but I think there maybe are some elements to it, and we see this a lot of times in playoffs or even before the playoffs in the BCS. It would come up. It's a different animal when you can play in your base defenses or comfortable defenses all season and you get really good at it versus playing a high-octane offense in postseason play that has weapons that you're not used to, because you start having to use different personnel groupings than you're used to, play different coverage schemes than you're used to, and sometimes you show cracks. The thing that I'm going to turn this around to you with, though, Daniel, is I think this goes both ways. We talk a lot about conference isolation, right? And you probably have a little mini rant on that, and we'll talk about later. But one of the tricks with conference isolation, or just isolation in terms of different play styles, right? Teams usually only play a couple really good offenses and a couple really good defenses in a given year, is sometimes we don't actually realize how good a team is. I think the Big Ten was replete with really good defenses this season. They did not have many good dynamic offenses. And I don't think we really realized how good Michigan's pass defense was, because even after the Ohio State game, Michigan's opponent average passing the ball is 6.7 yards per attempt. And that's putrid. That's like bottom half in the country is their average opponent. But what that really did is it meant that Michigan didn't have much of an ability to really distinguish themselves, because it's hard to hold a team under like 4 yards per pass attempt. There's enough stuff that you can scheme open for that to work, even if you're playing old school boring football. And so you never really distinguish yourself that much statistically. But against Ohio State, all of a sudden in our metrics, which are based off opponent averages, I mean, they did phenomenally in that football game. And I think it was really a level of play they could hit that no one had been able to challenge them to. And in most instances in those games, you find out the team can't hit that ceiling because it's very hard to do that. It's rare to find a defense that can play with somebody like Ohio State defensively. I think Michigan showed they might be a team that can. And if that's true, then that means TCU may be playing a defense of a caliber they have not seen, with some ability to do things that they haven't seen. The only team, the one team that really slowed them down was Texas, even though they won that game. Michigan is more talented, more sound than Texas. I think there's a potential to say that Michigan is sort of a latently good defense, as much as it is to say that TCU's offense might be able to give Michigan problems they're not used to. And hey guys, I want to take a quick break here to talk about our sponsor for 2022, and that's Bird Dogs. They've been with us all year, and you guys like to support us. We don't ask a lot from you. Support our sponsor. And this year we're pretty proud to sponsor them because Bird Dogs makes wonderful products. Here you got the shorts. You're sitting around the fire, drinking some eggnog, trying to show off your nice calves like a 17th century Englishman. And you can wear these wonderful shorts with great liners. You got pockets, form-fitting, cut to show off your booty. And hey, if you're like me and maybe your legs are pale and you know what, it's a little too cold to wear shorts, they make joggers and pants too. So check out Bird Dogs. Wonderful products, cheaper than Lululemon, but just as good a quality. And you know what? If you go to birddogs.com, enter promo code NERDS, and they'll throw in a free Bird Dogs rope hat. That's birddogs.com, promo code NERDS, and boom, a free Bird Dogs rope hat with your pair of Bird Dogs. The most comfortable shorts, pants, and sweatpants with built-in liners. You will not take these things off, I promise you.
Yeah, and in terms of modeling, I think it's a very important thing to call out because, and this is something that we missed and admitted we missed in our preview when we picked Ohio State to win. We didn't think Michigan's pass defense was going to be able to keep up with the explosive Ohio State offense. And we a lot of times talk about this in terms of run defense, where if your opponents don't run the ball very well, it's really hard. Like if your opponent averages 2 yards a carry, it's really hard to show that you're a really good defense by holding them to less than that, even though you might be. And this was the case, and we've talked about this with Ohio State opponents, where we felt like Ohio State has gotten away with playing in a league for years that when Ohio State's offense wasn't showing up, it didn't really matter because there wasn't an offense on the other side of the field they were facing that could take advantage of that. But the flip side is also true. It means that a Michigan pass defense that was really good was kind of hiding behind numbers that were not elite or great because it's so hard, like you said, to hold somebody to 4 yards of pass attempt. Like it's hard if they're not good to begin with to hold them to even worse than that. The thing that stands out to me for Michigan, other than the Illinois game, which Michigan fans told us that Illinois game, they were holding stuff back. That's complete hogwash. Nobody's holding stuff back to where they need a 4th down and long conversion and to hit a long field goal to win the game. Nobody's doing that. It was just an off day. They had people out. It was cold. Like, it happens. Other than that game, Michigan has been dominant. And that's something we can't say for Alabama. That's something we can't say for Georgia. Like, I don't know that they've had a particularly tough schedule, but 41-17 to Penn State, 45-23 Ohio State, 43-22 Purdue. You know, the Indiana game was ugly for 3 quarters. They had a coach collapse on the sideline, still ended up winning that game by 3 touchdowns on the road. And that's something to me, if I'm leaning one way or the other in this game, that really stands out to me if we're picking a game in the playoffs, because now you've got teams that have had a month off to really prepare, and the best version of them is what we're going to see. And to me, a Michigan team that's shown that they can consistently dominate gets into an air of eliteness that I don't know that we've seen from TCU. It's kind of reminds me of like some of the Notre Dame teams we've seen in the playoffs, or Cincinnati last year. You earned your right to be there, but that doesn't mean that you've played a season consistently enough to have us pick you to win. But what does the model say about this? Maybe it looks at it a little different, or gives us some nuggets of interest that we're not seeing so far.
Honestly, I think the model is pretty consistent with a lot of these takes. So the main sort of intermediate statistic is this percentage of opponent averages allowed. Michigan's been allowing 77% of opponent rush averages, 86% of opponent passing averages. And again, those numbers, they're not really elite numbers by our standards. Usually we say something sub 60% is a truly elite defense in the run game. They're not close to that, but I think they're better maybe than the stats indicate. And I think there's something to the fact that the Big Ten has been struggling so much with everyone in the conference that everybody's rush averages aren't great. And they're not great because everybody's defense is pretty good. And the problem is if everyone has a really good defense, and let's say that 6 of the top 10 defenses really are in the Big Ten, okay? Then your average numbers as a run team, as an offense, are going to be pretty bad. Because when you play a game, most of the time you're playing a good defense. You don't run the ball pretty well. And that means if Michigan plays you, well, you couldn't run the ball 3 other games because their defenses were good. And Michigan doesn't let you run the ball either, but it doesn't stand out because you struggled every week. And it starts to play this weird game where, holding teams to 77% of their averages may not seem impressive, but it may be that you're just the best of a lot of good units. Same deal with the passing defense. TCU's statistics in terms of defensive statistics are pretty pedestrian. 97% against the run, 92% against the pass. They've been very mediocre to average all season. Really a couple exceptions like the Texas game, but again, even those you can kind of explain away. Texas has had a few games where that offense just totally disappeared. And so when you start to look at the profiles, they start to look pretty similar offensively, pretty dissimilar defensively, and that leads to the edges. I think people underestimate the fact that Michigan runs the ball better than TCU, 5.6 yards per carry to 5.2 for TCU. They throw it almost as well, 8.2 yards per attempt to 8.4. And so you get this around 0.6 of a yard advantage for Michigan. That translates to a 30-25 score differential. And, for a game that I think right now is 7.5, Michigan, you can see it, right? It's basically saying Michigan, if you pretended the Big 12 and the Big 10 were the same, right? Our model, in large part, doesn't really adjust for conference strength. Michigan has played better in the Big 10 relative to what TCU's done in the Big 12. And then they're kind of taking that and then inflating the differential by 50% because they believe the Big 10 is a little bit better than the Big 12. And so the difference matters more than if it was just in conference play. You come up with a 7.5 point number. So I think everything's actually pretty explanatory, just like we said with Kansas State versus Alabama. I think most of these Big 12 games are tracking pretty closely with power ratings. And it really all comes down to whether you believe that the Big 12 power ratings are legitimate, because they're based on isolated ratings. And FEI and SP Plus and a lot of others have kept Big 12 teams very high all year. This has happened for a few years now, and it hasn't been tested because the Big 12 hasn't had a major appearance in postseason play. This year, I think it's getting tested. And so if you think the Big 12 is deserving of the rankings, that means one thing. If you think the Big 12's rankings are just, again, it's circling the wagons, basically isolated conferences, all these metric systems are mostly assuming that the Big 12 is equal with other conferences with slight recruiting adjustments. If you think that's not fair, then maybe you think this line is too low. But I think our model, the odds, I think, are all pretty closely tracking with the idea that the Big 12 is just a slight notch behind the Big 10.
So I know you just talked through some stuff, and I'm going to turn it right back around to you because I think this is an interesting point too. This game is hard for me to predict because I still don't know what I don't know. And I also don't know how much a month off to prepare, to get healthy, to introduce some interesting stuff schematically is going to benefit one team or the other. If you had to guess, and I know it's kind of a subjective question, but if you had to guess, Who does this month off to prepare benefit more, TCU or Michigan?
I mean, I can see arguments on both sides. And on TCU's side, they've got some more experienced players. I think they're a more aggressive team, just conceptually. So I could see them coming up with more wrinkles specific to Michigan and what they struggle with. And they're going to throw the kitchen sink in this game with abandon. On Michigan's side, it's kind of the opposite, right? They're a more conservative team in terms of how they attack defenses, in terms of their defensive schemes. But I think they've also got more youth in a lot of ways. Like, I think J.J. McCarthy's really not the player that he's destined to be. I don't know what his ceiling is, but I don't think he's hit it yet. And I think there's a lot more room for improvement over the bowl break than maybe you get with Max Duggan. So, yeah, I would probably lean towards TCU having some advantage. But I think at the end of the day, the thing that's probably going to matter more for this game is just who comes out of it less rusty. I think one of the more underestimated parts of college football in the postseason is that more often than not, I feel like teams come out of these bowl breaks with some offensive rust. I think that's why you often see these games being a little more defensive oriented at the start. And then usually the teams that are clicking more are the teams that are the most successful. And in that regard, I think the danger might be more significant, frankly, for TCU because they need for their scheme to work to be successful. If you look at TCU's offensive metrics, I mean, they're really, really good. And they've done that really despite not having, 5 stars all over the field. Michigan is a ground and pound team. And if you look at them statistically, they're consistent, they're effective. Again, their offensive metrics aren't that different than TCU's. And where they've come is by leaning on teams and getting to the fourth quarter, and then eventually the other team sort of breaks open and you get Edwards running downfield for huge plays. I think that travels a little better. So I think the time off probably benefits TCU in terms of what they do with the time. But the fact that there was a break, I think, favors Michigan. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that's the divide that I would make. And I would say to a certain degree, I would think all in all, I think Michigan is probably better off, despite maybe not making as good use of the time, in playing a game where you're coming in from having several weeks off and you're maybe a little bit rusty. The physical football team that relies on depth and a power running game against a defense that's not been particularly good against the run is probably the team that's going to have an advantage.
Yeah, I will say this in TCU's defense in terms of this game, and I'm ready to make a pick. I think Miller is going to pose a much bigger threat than Ohio State's run game just because Ohio State was so banged up. Their running back room was so banged up that I think it actually impacted their ability to scheme in that Michigan game. But I'm not sure that it's going to matter enough because I also think that, Deuce Vaughn is a great running back. I think he's an NFL caliber running back. I can see him giving Alabama fits. I don't think that Deuce Vaughn alone is the same level of running game, especially when you think about what Michigan brings to the table from an offensive line standpoint. I don't think that running game at Kansas State is the same thing that TCU's going to see against Michigan. I also think that I agree with you. I think the time off probably benefits TCU a little more, especially when we saw how beat up Duggan was at the end of that game. I think it benefits TCU, especially as a scheme-oriented team, and that's where their benefit lies. But I think having been there before helps Michigan. They're not going to be as wide-eyed. It's not going to be too big. The moment's not going to be too big for them. I've got Michigan 34, TCU 23.
And I think all of those are fair points in a game that I think is particularly difficult to handicap. I mean, we have games where we say it's difficult to pick because the teams are very even in quality, but in a lot of ways, this feels more like in week 1, week 2 out of conference matchup, where I don't really feel like I know the relative strength of these teams. Even though I've seen them play a lot of football, I don't know how much I trust the results of those games because they've been so, such different competition. And I don't know how you evaluate the level of competition properly between the Big Ten and the Big 12. I think the assumption is the Big Ten's a lot better. But if you want to break down why the Big Ten's better, I don't know what you point to. Michigan didn't play anybody out of conference, any Power 5 team out of conference. The Big Ten did have, some success out of conference like Penn State over Auburn, but Auburn was a bad team. Likewise, the Big 12 didn't play a ton of teams out of conference either, but they had some good results off and on. I mean, Texas hung with Alabama. Missouri was absolutely thumped by Kansas State. TCU, Colorado. There's a lot of stuff floating out there. I just think ultimately when you talk about matchups, I think TCU has struggled a little bit with teams that were physical at times. They played other games like the Texas game where they've shown up and played well, but Michigan's style of football, which is old school ball control football, I think may give TCU some problems because of the type of players that Michigan has. Their size and speed combo is just not something that TCU's used to facing. I think defensively, TCU can have similar problems on the offensive side of the ball. Something we haven't touched on is Blake Corum's out in this game. I mean, I expect Edwards to be pretty healthy, but that's definitely something, I guess, a knock against Michigan. But I still just think this is a game that is going to be a close competitive game for 3 quarters, and it's just a matter of whether or not Michigan can pull away like they have all year, or whether TCU can step up and make plays that matter in crunch time. I personally think Michigan's pass defense is what's allowed them to pull away, because teams, when they get in throw first mode, have struggled. I'm going to pick Michigan in this game. I'll pick them, I'm going to say 45-27. I don't think the game is that much of a blowout. I just think this is a game that's going to get away from TCU late. Now, it's probably the death knell for Michigan, because I have generally been pretty inaccurate with Michigan picks the last couple years. I will say, except for some of these out-of-conference matchups where I've been right, weirdly enough. So the games that should be more accurate or easier to predict, I've struggled with, and the games that are a lot harder and more subjective seem like they've been easier. So I don't know what you want to take from that. But yeah, that's my pick and take on it, and it will not shock me in the least if I'm completely wrong on this one.
For me, one last parting thought. A lot of Michigan's offense for 2 years now has been predicated on very explosive run and pass plays. If you take away, and I'm not saying take away because they do enough of it that it's their identity now, and you can assume that they're going to do it and do it well. But if you take away big plays against Ohio State, they don't win that game. If you take away big plays last year in a lot of their games, they don't win those games. So if TCU can find a way to limit the 68-yard run and this 70-yard pass, and force Michigan to go 80 yards, 75 yards, then it's a different ball game. But until Michigan doesn't do those things, I'm going to assume they will. So homework, yes. Score prediction, but also we're thinking of doing one more live show this year. So y'all let us know when we should do it. We're thinking Sunday after the playoff games, before the Rose Bowl. Should we do it after the Rose Bowl? Should we do it after the national championship game? I like the idea of having some results to talk about with some anticipation coming still, but we're going to let y'all kind of decide that. So let us know in the comments when you think we should do a live show, what works best for y'all. It's really disappointing the way they've scheduled these games, because they're Sunday and Monday, that we could have some great football instead. Looks like college football is scared of the NFL and going up against them. All right, y'all, let us know in the comments all these things and more. Thanks so much for hanging out this long. Y'all have a great week, and God bless.